Welcome, listeners, to the NKNews podcast recorded on March 1st, 2018. You might even hear some noise in the background from the passing March 1st demonstrators with their Korean and American and apparently also Israeli and United Nations flags. Joining me today in the studio are Oliver Hotham.
Hello.
Dagyum Ji.
안녕하세요.
Fyodor Tertitskiy.
Здравствуйте.
And it's just me, your host, Jacko Zwetsloot. Welcome, everyone. We'll be discussing a number of topical issues in the period between the end of the Winter Olympics and the start of the Paralympics. Before we get started, I need to tell you about our NKNews subscription giveaway valued at $300. One random reviewer on the iTunes or Apple Podcast app per week will win that free membership. So do please review us after this episode and you might win. That will enable you to read all the stories that we refer to on the podcast, as well as lots of other excellent information available at nknews.org. Let's get into our topics. So the Olympics are over. What was actually achieved? Apart from the medals, what was achieved politically in the Olympics? Oliver, do you want to kick off?
Absolutely. It's difficult to really say tangibly what was achieved. There was obviously a lot of nice hand-holding, and the two Koreas walked into the stadium with the United Korea flag. There were talks between the two Koreas, which seemed to be relatively productive. The South Korean president was invited to Pyongyang.
Yeah. Although he didn't immediately say he would go, did he?
He did not. He said he would create the conditions that would make it possible for him to go. So they're keeping it ambiguous for now.
We had Mike Pence in for the opening ceremony, and Ivanka Trump, in a lot of media, seems to be going just by a mononym of Ivanka, was there for the closing ceremonies.
Yeah, as we discussed in the last podcast, Pence's performance wasn't, I think the consensus was that it wasn't fantastic. He was quite off-putting. He didn't really engage with the North Koreans almost on purpose. He didn't stand to applaud the United Korean flag, which a lot of people were quite annoyed about. But Ivanka seems to have left a slightly better impression, although she didn't actually talk to the North Koreans. She was much more laid back, a little bit more diplomatic.
I think the great achievement is that the two Koreas broke the ice after 2-year pause in dialogue. I mean, there was no communication channels and hotlines between the two Koreas since February 2016, when the Park-geun-hye government decided to shut down Kaesong Industrial Complex. That means there was no way that Seoul and Pyongyang can communicate with each other, even in case of contingencies. But North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ordered to restore hotline in the tourist village of Panmunjom. I think that was the greatest achievement between two Koreas. And also...
Hold on, let me just interrupt. I think that's actually a very important one, isn't it? We can't overstate how important that is, that in case of an emergency or an accident, two sides in any situation need to be able to talk to each other. And the fact is that for 2 years, there was no way of even sending a fax or a post-it note between the two. And now there's a phone line restored. So that is a big deal. Do you think that's a big deal, Fyodor?
Officially, there was no line. I think that unofficially, we must have kept some secret channel of communication.
Can you imagine what that might have been?
I have no idea.
An email address?
I don't know. Maybe
Kakao
even
Talk?
Maybe Skype. I don't know. But it's pure speculation. But some North Koreans in top elite, they do have access to internet. So,
But it does, at least publicly or visibly, it's an important thing that they've re-established that line, don't you think?
yeah, I agreed on that.
During the era of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyung administrations, actually there was like secret channels between the Blue House and Kim Jong-il. But I think it could lead to the restoration of the hotline between two heads or two leaders in the two Koreas. So I think that's another point that we should...
Okay. All right. Well, what can we hope for? Can we imagine that there'll be North Koreans at the Paralympics? Have they announced that they'll be sending athletes? Will they be at the opening or closing ceremonies? What do we expect there, Oliver?
Well, they're sending a much smaller delegation than they sent to the main. Actually, smaller than they said they were originally going to send to the Paralympics, which is quite a surprise. I think
do we know what the numbers are?
something like 200. I can't remember the exact figure. And now it seems they're going to send about 24, I think is the number.
Just to remind our listeners, what was the total number of North Koreans who came down for the regular Olympics, including cheerleaders, athletes, coaches?
It's around 470.
470.
Yeah.
And they're also that includes also the performing artists who are here for the shows.
Yeah, include performing and cheering squad.
And musicians. Okay. So we've gone from 470, you say, down to less than...
24.
Goodness me.
I mean, it's a sign the Paralympics obviously aren't as important. Maybe the North Koreans felt that sending such a huge delegation to the previous games gave them a lot of press attention that they might not have necessarily liked all that much. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of coverage of the Kim Yong Chol visit last week that was not good for the North Koreans. I mean, the decision to send him, which we'll obviously get into later, was very strongly criticised in South Korean press. And with the North Koreans having complained about press coverage before, when press coverage was actually not extremely negative, that might have spooked them.
On the last day, just as the North Koreans were going home, there was a lot of television footage of the unified women's hockey team. The hockey players were crying and saying goodbye and let's meet again. My wife pointed out that she felt that any North Korean athlete who cries too much or looks too sad at going back to North Korea might end up receiving some harsh words, a reprimand at least from a coach or somebody back home for presenting an unfavourable image. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I think any danger of that probably outweighed by the desire. I mean, it's important not to assume that every emotion expressed by a North Korean is part of some, broader political strategy. But, it's a nice symbol for unification, which the North Koreans like as well. The two Koreas hugging and crying and we'll see each other again. And it's all very nice.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't suggest that any emotional outburst by North Koreans was a put on, but having watched variations of North-South reunions over the last 15 years, a theme that's come back to me from time to time is that North Koreans, at least the minders who are there present at the reunions, are anxious not to see too much sadness and too much tears when the time goes to say goodbye and go home.
I mean, that is the reason why civilian exchanges is necessary now, because public can actually watch the video, them crying and hugging each other while missing them each other, because we don't know when we can meet next time because of division of the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
I'm not sure about the punishment, but this is the whole purpose of why why people from the two Koreas should exchange.
If I may add something.
Please, Fyodor.
Yes, about punishment, what I know, at least in recent decades, when sportsmen are not really punished for some misbehavior. I mean, at very worst, it's just we have to do some self-criticism on the next ideological session, because we are prized. Mm-hmm. And if you just start shooting the sportsmen or sending them to concentration camp, the result would be that your country will very quickly run out of sportsmen.
Back to the Kim Yong Chol visit that you mentioned, Oliver. Fyodor, I think you would like to tell us about the implications of Kim Yong Chol. First of all, for our listeners, who is he, and what is he reported to have been responsible for in the past?
So Kim Yong Chol is a high-ranking North Korean military man, currently having a rank of 4-star general, who is perceived by South Korean public as a person who orchestrated an attack on South Korean military vessel, which was apparently sunk by North Koreans.
That was in, March 2010?
I think that's correct, near the Pyongyang Island, so in South Korean territorial waters, just south of the Northern Limitation Line. And the very thing that he is coming to South Korea angered the local right-wing forces, who were saying that he's a war criminal, that he shouldn't be coming, that Moon Jae-in is basically surrendering to North Korea, and the demonstration specifically aimed to prevent him coming here.
Let's just go back for a minute there. So why do many people think that he's responsible for the sinking of the Cheonan?
I do not know the exact source, but I think there were some hints by NAS publications. We should really check if it was done publicly, because if NAS says something public, we should really trust them. Or it were some rumors spread of them, because in these conditions, we shouldn't trust them at all.
The link was various South Korean officials at various points during the investigation after the sinking of the ship named him and named the Reconnaissance and Guidance Bureau as having been involved,
and he was the man in charge of the Reconnaissance and Guidance.
Yes, he was in charge at the time. But what's important to note, and what the Moon government said, was he was never officially named in the investigation that followed the incident, which said a North Korean torpedo had sunk the ship.
Right.
But he was not named in that. But there was a very strong sense in the mind of a lot of South Koreans that he was often described as the mastermind of the sinking.
Was he also supposed to be have been responsible for the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do Island in the same year, 2010?
The former defense minister acknowledged that he was one of the officials who masterminded the Cheonan sinking and Yeonpyeong shellings back in 2010. But it's not official stance, but that's personal stance, according to Minister of Unification.
Okay, so we have two incidents that may or may not have been on the conscience of Kim Yong Chol. As Fyodor pointed out, he's a four-star general in the Korean People's Army, KPA, although he didn't come in military uniform, did he, Fyodor?
No, he didn't, because he also occupies a party position, and normally if you present yourself as a civilian, you're not supposed to wear a military uniform and vice versa.
Okay, so he was coming in his capacity as a party member, was he?
Sure, like if you see Kim Jong-un, he never wears his marshal's uniform despite having the rank, because he is a head of a state, not just the army.
Inter-Korean talks is an important enough issue that people on the right have talked to various North Korean personalities over the years. Why would Kim Yong Chol be so special that they should block him from entering South Korea?
South Koreans may say that a crime against South Korean population is a big deal, while if a person is responsible for some worse things in the north, no one would care. And second, Kim Yong Chol, it's not that he out of sudden came out and say, well, I see this South Korean ship, let's sink it. Mm-hmm. He obviously received orders from Kim Jong-un, and people don't have problems with talking with Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il or whoever was in charge of North Korea, although the real responsibility for what happened should lie in the supreme leader, not some random general who followed his orders.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Now, you say that he was here in his capacity as a civilian member of the Korean Workers' Party. Do we know what his position actually is? Is his rank revealed? Yes, Dagyum?
Kim Yong Chol is vice chairman of Central Committee of Workers' Party of Korea, as well as director of United Front Department of Workers' Party of Korea Central Committee.
That's sort of the equivalent of the North Korean equivalent of the South Korean Ministry of Unification, isn't it?
Kim Yong-gon was the former director of the United Front of Department, so we can understand in that context.
Okay.
But Kim Yong-gon is dead.
Right. He was in Incheon for the Asia Games a few years ago, but he died, and so obviously he's not going to be coming again. Kim Yong Chol was coming in his capacity as a replacement of Kim Yong-gon.
I mean, of course he did. They directly call him that, and it would be extremely odd if he would visit South Korea in his capacity of a general in charge of Cheonan attack. Wouldn't you agree?
But I mean, the same man has two hats, so that's there's obviously some significance there. But what are the implications of the visit? Dagyum just said that it's supposed to lead to substantive talks. Fyodor, do you see substantive talks coming from this?
Not really.
What do we know anything about what Kim Yong Chol talked about and who he talked with?
Well, the primary thing that he said on Sunday, which kind of caught the headlines amid actually a quite dull visit, was that the North Koreans were interested in talking to the U.S.
Which came a couple of days after KCNA said that North Korea is not, what was their phrasing? We are not thirsting for talks with the United States.
They said something like, not in 100 years, we don't need them. They have this line that they keep saying that we're not begging for talks.
Right, not begging for talks.
But there's a certain ambiguity to what Kim Yong Chol said, because his words were relayed by the South Koreans. The South Koreans said, we want to encourage a situation where the North and the US could talk, and he apparently said, oh, me too.
Do we know who he actually said that to?
Blue House told media that during the meeting between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and the North Korean delegations led by Kim Yong Chol, and the Moon asked North to engage in dialogue between Washington and Pyongyang, and the North Korean delegation told Moon that they have ample intentions to engage dialogue with the U.S.
Okay, now I'm just curious that meeting between President Moon and the delegation led by Kim Yong Chol, did that take place at the Blue House?
As far as I know, the meeting happened just before the closing ceremony of the PyeongChang Olympics, so it happens in PyeongChang.
Ah, okay, right. So it's not like in the case where Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, was invited to a dinner at the Blue House and they had a private audience. This was a very much a less grand affair.
Less of a photo op.
Less of a photo op,
I think.
Yeah, right.
We didn't get the nice pictures of them having dinner and smiling at each other.
Right. Was Moon actually photographed with Kim at any time? Did we, apart from in the stadium when they were clapping, did they actually have any photo ops where that was staged photo ops outside that?
Interestingly, Blue House didn't provide any video or photos of Moon and Kim Yong Chol meeting.
Right.
Because they released a lot of photos when President Moon Jae-in met Kim Yo-jong and
Yes.
Kim Yong-chol and other North Korean officials.
Well, then what's next for inter-Korea relations? Fyodor, would you like to kick this off?
Next, Paralympic Games, during which we are safe. And after Paralympics...
Safe from what?
Safe from war. Safe from being killed by North Korean artillery firing at the building. We are sitting currently at the 25th floor, so if a war starts now, we'll likely all die.
Well, that's a reassuring thought.
So I'm saying that afterward we have joint drills by United Nations and South Korea.
Yes, the annual joint military exercises. I always forget the names. Is it Fall Eagle and Key Resolve? We usually expect them in April every year. When do Paralympics finish?
March 18th.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've still got a couple of weeks of March left before the drills or exercises are supposed to start.
And we're still waiting for the official date of the drills. They're keeping it for, they're saying we'll tell you once the Paralympics are done.
Yes, now I was talking to some high-ranking American officials yesterday who shall remain nameless, and was led to believe that there is no public notification necessary. The drills could just start one day, and that's how we will know. North Korea normally reacts to media attention about the drills, not the drills themselves.
Well, the Americans don't have to announce it, but they typically
do.
Yeah.
But they don't have to.
Because I don't think there's much point, apart from obviously the preparations that they need to... I mean, a drill is just a preparation for, if a war broke out, this is what we would do. But I mean, a big element of it is the optics of this big show of American and South Korean power. It's obviously partially to send a message to the North Koreans that this is what we could do to you if you mess with us.
Now, North Korea always says that the drills themselves are aggressive because they simulate a first strike on North Korea, an invasion of North Korea, and that's why they're aggressive. Fyodor, do you agree with North Korea's assessment of the drills?
I mean, yes, but it comes from the power which, like, once in 2 years says that they will turn Seoul into a sea of fire, so I guess it's 1-1.
And also simulates the blowing up of the Blue House and all sorts.
Yes.
Is that also included in the exercises?
What in the...
Oh, I'm sorry, you're talking about the North Korean exercise that simulate the blowing up of the Blue House. Yes, okay.
North Korean rhetoric is quite double standard. When someone here calls Kim Jong-un a fat pig, that's apparently a great slander against the supreme leader, but with them calling Lehman Bug rattling multiple times is perfectly okay.
I think that is a very fair point, isn't it? Dagyum, did you want to say something about that?
It is really important for Seoul to make breakthrough before April to avoid crunch times between the two Koreas before military drill starts. In general, inter-Korean relations are largely affected by the North Korea-U.S. relations and U.S.-South Korea relations. And the Moon administrations repeatedly say that they will work to make the improvement of the inter-Korean relations lead to dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington. Therefore, I think Seoul will focus on paving way for the nuclearization talks after Olympics. I think there is a huge gap between Washington and Pyongyang about the talks for the nuclearization. So the key part is that depends on whether Seoul can reduce the gap between Washington and Pyongyang.
America says that talks must be predicated on the outcome being the denuclearization of North Korea. We know that that's the sacred cow for North Korea. So will talks between the United States and North Korea be a non-starter?
Well, North Korea, in theory, has also said that it wants global nuclear disarmament. In theory, that's a commitment to denuclearization on their part when everyone else gives up their nuclear weapons on planet Earth. Not really a short-term strategy.
I'd say my prognosis is that the current situation is just going to continue. North Korea is not going to denuclearize. The United States are not going to accept freeze-for-freeze proposals. So the only way is that situation is just will go. Like, you can imagine a dysfunctional family where people are not prepared for a divorce, but then the differences cannot be rectified in any possible way.
We have heard this theory before, that essentially these things are in a cycle and the cycle is endlessly repeating. But what is different now is that North Korea either now has or is very close to having a credible threat against the continental United States. And that's something that means that the United States is unlikely to want to see that cycle continuously rotating again and again.
I'd say there was a statement by one retired American admiral, Dennis Blair, if I'm not mistaken, his name is, who said that if they wanted to strike on the United States many years ago, they could have done it by delivering an atomic bomb via submarine.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference is just symbolic that they can do it via ICBM. But if they wanted to blow a nuke in San Francisco, was a reasonable chance they could have done it under late Kim Jong-il.
I'm not sure. I don't know about North Korea's submarine launch capabilities 7 years ago.
Not to launch, but to bring it on submarine,
Yes.
unload it, and detonate it.
And detonate it. You'd want to think that the United States coastal protection and radar sonar facilities are a little bit better than to allow a North Korean submarine carrying a nuclear bomb into the waters off San Francisco. Now, I haven't spoken to this retired admiral, so I don't know exactly the scenario that he envisages. Oliver, do you know any more about this?
Well, I mean, it's a little concerning if he thinks that someone could just bring an atomic weapon into
He's
the
an
US.
admiral, so he is from the Navy.
Yep, that is true.
This is true. But then by that argument, any power with a nuclear weapon
Yes.
could just do that.
Well, not just the power. I mean, any group with money to buy the late Osama bin Laden could have bought a submarine with all his money and taken a dirty bomb to San Francisco and unleashed it there, you know.
I think it's more, the Americans don't like the idea of Kim Jong-un being able to just press a button.
Yes,
and it,
from long distance. That comes back to my idea that the cycle might be an endlessly repeating one, but America's unlikely to want to see that under current circumstances. Ratchet them up, decrease it, offer something, talks and talks, until another crisis begins again. Now, speaking of talks, let's talk about the veteran diplomat Joseph Yun of the State Department, who's announced his retirement, causing quite some concern about a loss of Korea-based or Korea-focused expertise within the State Department. What are we to make of all of this?
I mean, it actually reminds me of what we were talking about last time, which was still not being a US ambassador in Seoul. The problem with the Victor Cha case was that it was quite clearly something to do with Victor Cha's disagreements with the White House. As far as we can tell, Joseph Yun has actually retired. There's no suggestion that it was due to ideological differences, although Joseph Yun did have something of a reputation as being a guy that was very keen on diplomacy and had met with North Koreans in the past to secure the release of Otto Warmbier, and his temperament was as a career diplomat appointed by Barack Obama. I think it's safe to say that perhaps while he didn't retire for political reasons, his worldview was not necessarily in keeping with the current Trump administration's.
Although, he is 63 and there is a mandatory retirement age of 65. Joe Yun said the longer the title, the less important the job or something. And what was his last title at the State Department?
U.S. Special Representative for North Korea Policy is his last title.
And Assistant Secretary of State for Japan and Korea.
So that's a double mouthful there. It's quite a long title, yes.
But as the writer of that article pointed out, there's
Yes.
an extremely important role, so proving his own mother wrong by his job title.
Joseph Yun is chief nuclear negotiators in the U.S., part of six-party talks, so I think it's very, very important role.
I'd say he used to be part of six-party talks because six-party talks haven't existed since when?
2008?
Yeah.
Yes.
10 years.
10 years, so
years.
it's really a dead project.
So do you think it's a big deal then, Fyodor, that the retirement of Joseph Yun?
I'm not sure. I mean, with United States, you can never predict. They have become what they said about North Korea, some unpredictable power behaving completely erratic. That's my impression of the current administration's policy, because all these zigzags, all these ups and downs are absolutely impossible to trace.
Who do we see as being a possible replacement for Joseph Yun?
Well, our writer suggested Mark Lambert, who was head of the Korea desk at the State Department, I think still is. I'd have to double check that. Korea diplomat, someone from the State Department, someone with some expertise in North Korea. Given the track record, as we've seen with the ambassador to South Korea, he might just not be replaced.
Okay, well, now the North Korean Foreign Ministry, the equivalent of the State Department, they've had a bit of a reshuffle there recently, and now their own nuclear negotiator, Choi Son-hee, who would have met with Joseph Yun, I imagine, at some time in the past, she's now raised to vice minister level. Is this a sign of things to come? What does it mean?
In my personal opinion, I don't think this is necessarily a sign of talking to U.S. at this point. Choi Sun-hee was the person who is in charge of like American affairs in the DPRK ministry, but she also has connections with the Russia and other countries. So maybe this is because of like internal reshuffle stuff, considering external relations with the US and other countries.
Well, it wasn't something that they publicized. I mean, NKNews was able to report on it because we had diplomatic sources. So it wasn't like something that North Koreans had announced with the purpose of sending the message to...
Very good point.
That is a very good point. So it actually hasn't been reported yet in either the KCNA or Rodong Shinmun or anything like that?
Not that I've seen.
Yet.
That is okay. Fyodor, do you want to talk more about that?
Yes, I'd say, looking at it from a completely different aspect, I'd say it's nice to have a woman at such a high-ranking position in a very conservative nation where women are being systematically discriminated against. We don't have that high-ranking women who are not linked to the Kim family. Her father was a premier, but the important thing, this is not enough, because she wouldn't have been promoted there to such a high position if she wouldn't be a skilled individual, and she probably is.
But what about the suggestion that being a vice minister or even a minister in North Korea isn't necessarily that important, because they, particularly in the foreign ministry, they don't necessarily have any decision-making power. The decision-making power is held by people who we don't normally see in public, by party members whose positions we don't necessarily know. In that case, Choi Sun-hee might be just a face to put forward to negotiate with America, but the real decisions are still made in Pyongyang by somebody else.
Well, diplomacy, that's partially true, but diplomacy is often about the little work as well. It's not always about the grand strategy. It's often about relationships between diplomats who might be on opposite ends of an argument. And I mean, history has shown some great diplomatic strides have been made simply by two diplomats just getting along personally. So I think the personality does count quite a lot. So that might be why. Maybe people like her.
And it's also that strategic decisions are not made by some unknown guy in one of the departments of the Central Committee, but are made by the man whose smiling face we see so often, by Kim Jong-un himself.
In a way, the promotion of Choi Sun-hee may be a signal that the Pyongyang put emphasis on talks between Washington and Pyongyang, given that she has been like worked with the U.S. several times in the past.
So it could be a hopeful sign, but again, it could also be a bit of tea leaf reading.
I don't really agree. I'd say some unannounced promotion of some official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think we're putting too much. It's not like Kim Jong-un or whoever was in this was looking, but this may hint at some improvement in the United States. It was probably done because of her career and because she was suitable for this position.
Well, I guess it's something we can put down on a list of things to revisit a year from now to see if it actually did mean anything. Are there any other big stories this week on NKNews.org, Oliver, that you'd like to talk about?
There's always big stories on NKNews.org. I think something that was particularly interesting, escaped a lot of attention, was probably this continued ship-to-ship transfer stuff. It was the fourth in a month. The Japanese Ministry of Defense took a photo, has taken several photos over the last month of transfers on the high seas off the coast of China between North Korean vessels and vessels that are sometimes linked to Chinese companies. It's believed to be, now that sanctions are placing very strong restrictions on North Korea's energy supply, this seems to be the primary way that North Korea is essentially avoiding that embargo.
Is it supposed to be oil in all cases?
The ships involved are oil tankers.
Okay.
And it's not going to be fluffy toys.
Especially in the context of recent news from Beijing, like proposed constitutional reform, which will probably pass National People's Congress. So Xi Jinping may very well stay with us for a long, long time, and his policy will become much more long-term.
And why is that significant in this case?
In this case, because Xi Jinping is probably the one ordering the policy on North Korea, including the oil and the policy of what to do with companies who engage in ship-to-ship transfer. So we can say that his policy can be extended for potentially decades.
Yeah, there has been argument from Washington that the North Korea try to unify the Korean peninsula under the unified communist system. And this is the reason why Kim Jong-un has developed nuclear weapons. The reason why the Trump administration's made a claim is that they try to drive a wedge between the two Korea.
Last week, I think we were talking about North Korea trying to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. So it's a little bit rich, all these competing claims of wedge driving being thrown around, isn't it?
And they also, the North Koreans in that same article also said, well, why do you think we've gone through all of this economic pain to develop ICBMs that we can tip with nuclear weapons to take South Korea, palm-sized South Korea?
They said palm-sized.
Which is sort of hinting that they could take it if they wanted to, really. Right. But they just haven't bothered.
Does this article in the Rodong Shinmun, Dagyum, does it say anything positive about North Korea's view of unification? We know North Korea's view of unification is not using nukes to unify the peninsula, apparently. What is it? Does it say anything about that?
So the whole point of the article is that they try to criticize the Trump administration's strategies toward North Korea. What they are arguing is that Trump administrations eventually try to drive a wedge between the two Koreas because Seoul and Pyongyang has improved their relations. So it's not they didn't clarify their intentions to unify the Korean peninsula in the articles, arguing that the U.S. doesn't like the atmosphere for dialogues between the two Koreas, and this is the pretext for building armament on the Korean peninsula, and this is for upcoming joint military drills.
So the drills are mentioned, okay. And it's always about the US building arms on the Korean peninsula to prepare for another invasion of North Korea. This is a recurring theme for decades, isn't it? Let's finish up with what I hope will be the first of a recurring series of sections, which is the nominations for the silliest North Korea-related story or headline of the week from mainstream media. Those of us who've been watching North Korea for a long time have seen the silliest things come across our headspaces, such as
eaten by dogs.
It was Jang Son-taek was supposed to be eaten
was
by
allegedly
dogs.
Eaten by hungry dogs.
Right.
North Koreans believe in unicorns.
That's right, the unicorn, or they found the lair of the unicorn. Perennial favorite of all photographers who go to North Korea. Rare glimpses of life in Pyongyang, rare glimpses of life in North Korea, or these are the photos that Kim Jong-un didn't want you to see. Right, we've all seen those. So what have we got on this week? What's the silliest story or headline? Fyodor?
North Korean cheerleaders had some masks of a young man, and when some South Korean right-wing politician accused them of actually having a mask of young Kim Il-sung, which is, frankly saying, an insane statement, because you cannot do that to Kim Il-sung pictures in North Korea. This, such treatment of Kim Il-sung portraits will get you executed immediately. The very idea they would bring some masks to pose as multiple Kim Il-sungs sitting on tribunes is beyond stupidity.
Okay, I'd like to push back on that a little bit. I don't think it's quite that insane. I think, on the one hand, only if you understand reverence in which North Koreans are taught to hold the image of Kim Il-sung can you say that it's insane. But in the South Korean perspective, that photo does look like an early photograph of Kim Il-sung. I've seen the two side by side. I can see the resemblance quite strongly.
I think, from what I understood, they were using a picture of a kind of generic, handsome Korean man. And I think for North Koreans, perhaps the image of a generic, handsome young man is the image of Kim Il-sung, because it's everywhere in this revolutionary art. But it also speaks to the degree of overreaction that a lot of South Korean media might have had to pick up on the North Koreans trying to kind of undermine South Korea at every possible turn. Obviously, the North Koreans behave the same way to the South as well. Yeah. Decided that the North Koreans have smuggled in these marks of Kim Il-sung to use as propaganda.
At the very least, having the North Korean cheerleaders wearing the anonymizing masks of an unidentified young North Korean man, it was slightly creepy, wasn't it? It was an odd image, seeing them swaying back and forth in the tribunes with this mask on their face. Didn't you think it was a bit creepy, Dagyum?
It's a bit creepy, but that's not the point. But I want to point out that this is the representative example of how South Korean media distort the fact in a way. The conservative media really is unhappy with what's going on the Korean peninsula, especially the North's participation in the PyeongChang Olympics. And this is a result of the distorted media report. It could be Kim Il-sung's face. There is still a chance that
it can't be.
But media should cover the story from neutral stance, not biased stance. So this is quite bad examples. that how South Korean media covered the PyeongChang Olympics.
Yeah, I think to be fair, though, in this case, the media didn't make up the story themselves. They were simply following the story that they'd been given by the politicians who pointed it out. Right? It first came out because of the, what is the new name of that party? The Bareun Minju Jongdang, is that the name of the party? Anyway, it was Ha Tae-gyung of that party who I believe was the first to come out with a photograph and say, we believe this is a mask of Kim Il-sung. It was not as if the media made it up by themselves.
Yes, it's just one person.
Yeah.
And of course, he may not know North Korea, but he is a member of parliament. So he is a person who writes law for this country, according to which tens of millions of people actually live. He should have some basic understanding of the chief enemy this country has, and not disgrace himself and his party like that.
The image of the young Kim Il-sung to whom that mask is supposed to resemble, is that actually an image that most North Koreans today would be familiar with? I mean, we've seen it here in history books, but we know that North Korea, they tend to have a very standardized number of portraits of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. That's not one of those standardized images. Would they actually be familiar with the image that we're talking about in North Korea?
From many historic films, of course. Any film they would watch about 1940s, they would have a picture of young Kim Il-sung. So,
okay.
Yes, if you watch TV, then you know.
All right, well, that's where we will leave our episode for today. Thank you very much again to our studio guests, Oliver Hotham.
Thank you.
Dagyum Ji.
감사합니다.
Fyodor Tertitskiy.
Большое спасибо.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. Don't forget, you can listen to all of our past episodes, as well as read full bios and show notes on our website, nknews.org. NK News is the leading repository of North Korean research, news, and analysis, and we hope to see you there. And you can also send feedback, comments, questions, and guest suggestions to podcast@nknews.org. Our podcast was produced by Arius Durr and facilitated by Chad O'Carroll and Christina Lee. Lastly, a reminder that one random reviewer on the iTunes or Apple Podcast app per week will win a free NK News membership, so please review us after listening and you might win. Thank you very much for listening, and hear me next time.